4, 3, 2, 1. Good evening, YouTube. Melvin, Black Geekery. Another video, also Dune related. Because my first video cut out due to time limits, this video is going to continue where the last left off. The first was, who is the main antagonist of Dune? And the most important part to follow it up is, so with the first video, we outlined who the main antagonist of Dune was. In this case, it was Gaius Helen Mohaim. This video is about identifying who the main protagonist is, and it's very much helped by knowing who the main antagonist is. So, with that in mind, 3 ground rules. 1. (1982). So the thing test is first rule is the thing test. You want to know the source of your opinion broadly. Basically, you don't want something to be your opinion if it's actually something you're just regurgitating wholesale from another source. It's really not your opinion. It's just something you're putting out there to deflect from whatever you actually feel or to avoid coming up with your own ideas. It's very natural to do. So you do want to just ask, is this something that I've heard before just on the internet? It doesn't need to be specific. It's just, you know what, I think I read that on the internet somewhere. That's it. And then you can just say, okay, these are not my real opinions. I don't have to feel, if somebody says something negative about it, it's not really my opinion, so I don't need to defend it. It's just something I read on the internet. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Who cares? It's the internet. So 2, Gam Jabbar. The idea there is, it is your idea, it is your opinion, but basically, is this opinion or thought an avoidance of pain or uncertainty? Essentially, you might have opinions that you don't really you don't really believe them to be there, but it's something you just put out when you're thinking about a topic, because even if it's something as light as science fiction, there are implications for some of your opinions that you start to think, whoa, this thing is actually having a bit of an impact. Essentially, whenever you have that transformative interaction with media where it shifts your opinion, you start to have these reactive dismissals, slogans, whatever, where you try to discount it and you just your brain just immediately rejects and just toss something out there. You do need to, at some point, resolve it down to, okay, I personally had a virulent reaction to the 1619 project. And then I actually looked into why, there just seemed to be numerous steps taken that were not, it was not good journalism, but it was done under the appeal to good historicism. The problem is, proper historicism has stricter codes of conduct than journalism. So if you're not doing a good job as a journalist and you're claiming to be historical, then you need to be even better than you are as a journalist. So if you're writing real history, which it is being used in history books as a history book, you need higher standards than what it would take to be in the New York Times, not less. But if you're saying this isn't proper journalism in the traditional sense, so you don't need to follow journalistic standards, and then you're using this as history, then what are you doing? So it was just that realization that it was neither journalism nor history, and it was whatever it is when something claims to be better than journalism or history, acting under the aegis of journalism with the goal of creating an orthodoxy for history. Never mind that they were already killing Native Americans from 1607 on. So apparently that's not a part of what went into founding Virginia. Who knew? 3. Identity. So when you put an opinion under evaluation, you eventually get to a point where you have several things that when you first determine, okay, I can get myself emotionally distant. I know that these opinions are coming from my brain and not just something I read on the internet or something I read from a review. It's actually something that I genuinely have an emotional investment in, but it's not so much that I'm just virulently using that because I don't want to think about something else. And then you have the identity where it's like, okay, this is your actual, you now have these ideas. Sometimes you might have 2 or 3 on a topic as far as a potential conclusion. And just like in Identity with John Cusack, you kind of need to prune the hedges. Like one of these is real, the others are really just defense mechanisms to avoid the complications of that reality. So, with that said, we're looking at who is the main protagonist of Dune, and how would you determine that? Well, I would like to think, what is a protagonist? Or better yet, a main protagonist. Well, and this is internet, vaguely. I like this definition. It basically nails some of the broader things. 1, actions move plot. Okay. 2, So what this second part means, so the first part is they're the main person moving the plot ahead, right? That's pretty straightforward. Second, characters are changed by the interactions with characters changed is greater than change by characters. So the protagonist changes throughout the story, but while the protagonist changes, they change the world more. So when the character has an epiphany or a transformation, that changes the world more than they're actually changed. So individual characters that are in the story are often changed by the protagonist more than the protagonist is changed by any of those individual characters. So that's a key aspect. 3. So conflict with the main antagonist is going to clarify what the main theme is. So this becomes pretty much, so you actually end up needing the main antagonist to determine your main protagonist. Now you can say, everybody knows that the main protagonist is Paul. Okay. Well, if Paul is the main antagonist, who is the main antagonist? Well, who shows up more in the marketing materials for Dune Part 1? Baron Harkonnen. Who shows up in the marketing materials for Dune Part 2? Fade. Do either of those come across as a main antagonist? Well, Fade only shows up in the second movie. He's pretty cool, and then he's dead. Baron Harkonnen shows up in the first movie. He's he's more of a reactive force in the second, and then he too is dead. This is a trilogy, so who will arrive at the end to be an antagonist that is not really brought down? Well, the leader of the Bene Gessrit. The Bene Gessrit haven't really been hit at all by any of this. And the fact that the Emperor, which we went into in the last video, the Emperor was doing things on the orders of the Bene Gessrit. So it is the Bene Gessrit that, the leadership of the Bene Gessrit, that is driving this conflict with House Atreides. And so we need to understand what the heck is going on. Because we need to actually see who meets these criteria, who meets these two criteria, and then the conflict with the main antagonist is going to define your theme. So one aspect is, unless there's a confrontation with the main antagonist, there isn't really a case for someone being the main protagonist. Period. So, given how few characters make it through both movies, this actually makes things relatively straightforward. 1. Take tests. 2. Gouge bar. 3. Identity. So, first, whose actions move the plot? Okay. So we have. So first off, they have to be in the first and second movies. So we have Chani. She made it through both movies. Duke Leto does not make it through both movies. What's his name? DeVries, the rogue mentat, doesn't make it through both movies. Thufir Hawat isn't even shown in the second movie. So we do have Gurney, but Gurney is clearly a support character. We do get Stilgar. Okay, we got Stilgar. We got Lady Jessica. So we have Lady Jessica, we got Chani, we got Stilgar, we obviously have Paul. And I guess you might as well put Gurney up there. So we got Gurney, we got Paul, we got Lady Jessica, we got Stilgar, and we got Chani. Okay. Now, does Gurney's actions themselves move the plot? He can't get access to the nukes, but he knows where they are. So he's aiding Paul. Lady Jessica, is she doing things to move the plot ahead? Yes. Stilgar, is he doing things to move the plot ahead? Yes, but he's also doing things to help Paul. Chani is doing things to help Paul, but she's questioning on that. So one of the issues with Chani is that her actions are in direct violation of the rules of the Fremen, which were built to protect the Fremen from people who really aren't cut out to be Fremen. This saves Paul's life, but given that she storms off over what he becomes, well, that's one part of the cautionary tale, but I do have some issues about that. I think Paul is not the protagonist of a precautionary tale. He's the monster. So we need so your main protagonist, and also Lady Jessica. So I think everybody's actions are moving the plot ahead, but I think Lady Jessica is different. And the reason that Lady Jessica is different is Paul does not want what she's doing. He doesn't like what she's doing. He didn't approve of it. But he ultimately has to go along. So ultimately, while she's ostensibly doing actions to help Paul, she wants Paul to be the chosen one. Paul doesn't want to be the chosen one. So his actions are actually meeting her goals. So one of the themes of a parent is the vicarious trap. I want to be special, but because of circumstances, I'm not able to be the special person I feel I am, but I can make my child do the things that I couldn't do. As a result, Paul is following the orders of his mom, even though he doesn't necessarily like it. So that's actually indicating the possibility of Lady Jessica being the protagonist. Second, whose actions move the plot? Yeah. The problem is, Stilgar is unambiguously Team Paul. As such, his actions are determined by what Paul wants. Gurney, unambiguously Team Paul, is determined by what Paul wants. A protagonist has to be to some degree self-actualized. They have their own wants and desires. Essentially, an agency having character. So Chani has agency. Lady Jessica clearly has agency. Paul has agency. Paul's sister is not actually born by the time the second movie ends. She's definitely going to be important in the third movie, but she's not there, literally not yet. So next, So, with only 3 protagonists that have interactions with each other, what we really have is Chani versus Jessica, Chani versus Paul, and Paul versus Jessica. So, when it comes to Chani versus Jessica, when these two have an interaction, whose path is shifted? Who moves? Basically, when these two meet on a bridge, who is giving way to who? Who is giving way to whom? If Lady Jessica tells Chani to do something, and Chani says, you do it, who's going to win? Who wins that argument in the movie? Lady Jessica. The reason? When push came to shove, Lady Jessica can just make Chani do what she wants. And that's exactly what she did. So it's kind of like whatever your power is versus coercive telepathy, it really just means that the coercive telepath has 2 power sets. 1, they can take over people's minds, and 2, they can have you do whatever they want you to do. So they really have 2 powers, not 1. Chani versus Paul. So who ends up changing their path more? Does Paul get changed by Chani to become less than who he was? Or does Chani eventually change who she is in response to Paul's transitions over the course of the movie? That's unambiguous. See, when she storms off and leaves, she stops being Fremen. She goes off, like, Paul has unified the South, the North is destroyed. She's no longer Fremen. She's an outcast. She outcast herself in response to what Paul had become. And there's no argument. She can't pretend that he's not the Lisan al-Gaib. He literally meets every qualification. And the reason he meets every qualification is that the Bene Gessrit set the qualifications for the Lisan al-Gaib, and their programming, their breeding program, specifically made someone exactly like him to meet those qualifications. He's designed to meet the qualifications that were set by the Bene Gessrit. Now, does that meet a thing test? Is that my own idea? Or if it's not my idea, like, my idea is that Chani's changed more because she stops being Fremen. Yeah, that's defined in the text, so it meets the thing test. Am I trying to avoid something here? Not really. The standard notion is that Paul is the protagonist. He's one of the big faces on the movie poster. The other thing is, so is Rebecca Ferguson. So you have those 2 actors, actor and actress, that are right up there. So you have those 3 are the real candidates for the main character. So the third, we're getting to that. We need to see who is the main axis on which other people are reacting. So it really just comes down to this confrontation. Now, for book readers, you will know that Lady Jessica's realization that her father is Baron Harkonnen is made by Paul. And this is basically the prototype for her reaction, is essentially the prototype for Luke's reaction to Darth Vader saying, "I am your father." And many Dune fans have noted that. So in the books, it's unambiguous. Paul is the main character. That moment and in the transition establishes it, because Lady Jessica has shown herself to be head and shoulders above everyone else in terms of being able to drive the narrative. The only character who we didn't know could maybe drive the narrative as much was Paul. And that was the moment where you realize that Paul is going to be your main character going ahead, whereas everyone is really reacting to her presence and her actions. So in the book, Paul is the main protagonist, and so he would be so in that case, as he's the protagonist, the cautionary tale is what he has to turn himself into. So in that regard, yeah, if you're going by the book. But that's not what we see. Paul doesn't realize the truth about his ancestry until he is pressured into becoming the Kwisatz Haderach. And the reason he's pressed into becoming the Kwisatz Haderach is because Lady Jessica forced that situation. So Lady Jessica wants the holy war after she becomes a Reverend Mother. Paul wants the holy war after he becomes the Kwisatz Haderach. So in that regard, we now have two criteria. One, Lady Jessica is able to drive the plot more because Paul is ultimately following the lead that she is setting. Two, Paul is clearly transformed by the actions of Lady Jessica more than Lady Jessica is transformed by anything Paul is doing. He's doing what she wants him to do, or he's resisting doing what she wants him to do. And when he resists doing what she wants, she just keeps doing what she's going to do to get him to do it anyway. And he ends up doing it anyway. So, see. So you have two completely different. You actually have three different themes, if depending on who is the main character. With Paul, right? With Chani, so with Chani, I think the narrative is the heart is a perilous guide. And with Jessica, so with Jessica as the main protagonist, I'm not actually sure what the theme is just yet. Because it has to be her conflict with the main antagonist. And the big problem here is when she confronts the main antagonist, she says, "You picked the wrong side." And the response, there are no sides. Reverend Mother. I think our theme, and this might have to be a third video. Uh, Okay. Um, there's an old myth, well, not as old as the Greek myths, but during the, I guess, the Middle Ages, or the Islamic Golden Age, there was a myth of the merchant of Baghdad. And what happens is the merchant is in Baghdad, and while he is going about buying and selling, he sees death smile at him. He then goes to his senior merchant and says, I saw death smile at me in Baghdad. And his boss says, you need to go to Medina to avoid death. And when he goes to Medina, he doesn't see death. He goes to his house, and there is death to claim him. And the death says, it's your time. And the merchant says, why did you smile at me in Baghdad? And and death says, I smiled at you in Baghdad because I'm supposed to collect you in Medina. And so it's basically trying to avoid your fate, you confirm it. That the idea of there are no sides meant the goal of the Bene Gessrit was to make the Kwisatz Haderach. Whether it's Paul or Fade's child with Lady Jessica's daughter, that really doesn't matter. If it happens 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it doesn't matter. The issue is, what is the Kwisatz Haderach supposed to do? Well, the Kwisatz Haderach is the Lisan al-Gareeb. Well, what is the Lisan al-Gareeb going to do? He's going to make the desert planet of Arrakis, which is the only source of spice, which is necessary to keep billions of people alive, into a planet that is no longer a desert. Well, what happens when the thing when something that requires a particular condition is no longer available and people can't survive without it? They die. That it was always front and center that they were all about eugenics. And so when she makes him into the Lisan al-Gareeb, when she makes him into the Kwisatz Haderach, whatever it is that he was supposed to do, that everything has been set up for him to be able to do, if he's going to do that, you kind of need to know what it is. And given ultimately she's the most proactive person, but she was really reactive until she becomes a Reverend Mother. Once she gets all of that history and all of the history of all of her prior Reverend Mothers with all of their fanatical programming, she really stops being Lady Jessica and she becomes Reverend Mother Jessica. So you really have a case of this character turns into another person whose goal is to fulfill the Bene Gesserit breeding program, which is to create the Lisan al-Gareeb. And what is he going to do? He's going to remove most of the spice from the universe. So basically, he's going to kill almost everybody who has an addiction to the spice that isn't important enough to have a stockpile of it to survive the transition. So I don't think that's what she wanted to do before she became a Reverend Mother. I think what she wanted to do was to protect Paul, to protect House Atreides, and to basically not be evil. And she was pretty convinced that if she was going to have a daughter, and this is the underlying conflict, by the way. So the conflict comes down to this: Chani versus Guy's Helen Mohaim. What do these two have against each other? The depression and destruction of the Northern Fremen. Now, I say the Northern Fremen because it really is just the Northern Fremen. The Harkonnens didn't think there was anyone in the South. So they literally didn't oppress or destroy the Southern Fremen because they didn't know they existed. Granted, she admits the condition in the South was so bad that only fanatics lived there. But those millions of fanatics were waiting on the Lisan al Gaib. The Lisan al Gaib was going to basically commit mass genocide as part of a eugenics breeding program. So she has beef with Guy's Helen Mohaim, but frankly, Guy's Helen Mohaim doesn't give two shits. And she also knew about the Southern Fremen because she would have the memories of every prior Reverend Mother, so they knew damn well they were down there and what they were there to do. Paul versus Guy's Helen Mohaim. The issue with Paul was not that he could not be a chosen one, but that he would not be a pliable chosen one. Specifically, at the time, Lady Jessica was not a Reverend Mother. Guy's Helen Mohaim was a Reverend Mother. She was not confident that the Bene Gessrit would be able to control the Atreides as well as they could control the Harkonnens. Now, they obviously have the Gom Jabbar test. So whoever they have has to meet their criteria of not just being an animal driven by instinct, but they also need to be pliable. Fade was pliable. The assumption is that Fade's children would be more pliable to the Bene Gesserit than Paul. And that's why they would prefer him to be the one. They would prefer Fade's children, however cruel and sadistic they are, to lead the genocide because they could control them. So Paul could be the chosen one. Fade's kids with Lady Jessica's daughter could be the chosen one. They could both be the chosen one. So the issue is not that there is a chosen one, it's that there are multiple candidates. That this is really a narrative that's going to be written after the fact about how inevitable Paul is. But if Paul were to die, the Fremen would still go on their rampage. Okay. And in the decades that's happening, Fade would end up having a kid, or even if Paul and Fade both killed each other, Fade's kid and would be a daughter, and they might have to wait a generation or two, but they would still be able to pull it off because they would still have the Atreides bloodline, they would still have the Harkonnen bloodline. So next is Jessica, and this is different than this. Lady Jessica disobeyed straight up what she was supposed to do. She knew what her job was. She knew she could do that job, and she just decided to not fucking do it. I don't know what organization anyone has ever worked in, but high insubordination at the most critical juncture of a project, of a long-term project, on the eve of completion, because you didn't feel like it, is the kind of stuff that you need to make some really dramatic examples. That's exactly what that first movie was. I'm increasingly convinced that that is the narrative that you're going to get in the confrontation in the third movie, is really that the destruction of the Atreides is a dramatic example of what happens when you play F around and find out with a Reverend Mother when you are in the group. Lady Jessica's a Bene Gessrit. Lady Jessica is not a Reverend Mother. Reverend Mothers don't order other Reverend Mothers around the way they do. It's essentially, if you're in a fraternity or a sorority and you have a chapter leader, right? And you're a pledge, and the chapter leader is basically hazing you. They tell you to do some shit that you really don't want to do. You can either not do the thing and not be in the fraternity and not be in the order, or you do it and you get it and you might get in. But at no point do you wait until you know that they can't get rid of you to then say, go f yourself. You don't get to do that and not face some consequences, because if you just let that stand without a consequence, you no longer have an order. You just have a bunch of people doing whatever they feel like because they don't think there are any consequences. With that said, I think there might actually be some interesting dynamics, because one thing about this is there's a theme similar to Star Wars. So in part one, I think the argument would be that your central protagonist in part one was Obi-Wan. Really, everybody was reacting to Obi-Wan more than Obi-Wan was reacting to anyone else. Or better yet, I'll say episode 4. In episode 5, even Darth Vader was really reacting to Han Solo. He was going where he realized that Han Solo was going to go. So that really means that Vader is reacting to Han Solo. The reason that Luke is going to Cloud9 and confronting Darth Vader is because he needs to rescue the rebellion, the people in the rebellion, Leia, Solo, all of them. But he's really going there because Han Solo went to Cloud9 and got captured. Then we get to episode 6. And the character who everyone is being changed by more than they are being changed is and a lot of people are going to say that, well, the ultimate antagonist is the Emperor, and you're correct. And his confrontation with the Emperor is that he renounces the path of the Jedi, which is you fight the Sith and you kill the Sith. He's like, I'm not going to do that. And what does this in Return of the Jedi is that when Luke finally takes over as the protagonist, he breaks the cycle. So he breaks the Jedi cycle. And the main antagonist, Emperor Palpatine, we don't understand what happens there until we get the prior trilogy of the Law of Two. The Emperor closes the Sith cycle. What I mean by that is, when Vader kills the Emperor, that is not this amazing restorative thing on its own. Because Sith kill the Sith all the time. Sith, like, apprentices kill their master all the time. It's literally how they become a Sith master instead of a Sith apprentice. That's how it works. So he closes the cycle off because when he gets killed by Vader, he kills Vader. Like, he knew he was screwed, but he just took him with him. So the cycle is closed. And for all the flaws people might have about the sequel trilogy, they basically have him he then actually closes the cycle directly. His own attack kills him. by his own daughter, by his own granddaughter. So he closes the cycle literally this time. He becomes his own closed loop of self-annihilation. Now that's almost like a diversion from the underlying issue of this confrontation, is that there isn't a confrontation, because because the confrontation is, she says you picked the wrong side, but when Lady Jessica remember, the theme for Chani is the heart is a perilous guide. So that was a perilous guide because so Reverend Mother Jessica is completely loyal to the Bene Gessrit plan. Gaius Helen Mohaim knew there were millions of Fremen, but she only said that there are signs of human inhabitants in the southern half. But she would know fully well how many there are. Which means they're both on the same side. So the issue here is they're on the same side. That's your big reveal in the second movie, is that they're really on the same side now. They're both Reverend Mothers. So your real confrontation in Dune 3 is really Paul versus the Bene Gesserit. That the confrontation that we haven't really seen yet is Paul getting out from his mother and really asserting himself as an individual person in some fashion. That confrontation is what the third movie, I think, is going to really be about. I dare say it's an Orestes type confrontation. So maybe Orestes, because it's Lady Jessica's actions, not just in having Paul, but in trying to have him become the chosen one, that she taught him the ways of the Bene Gesserit, which was illegal. And that is what led to the reaction. She's deciding when and how their project reaches completion, and that is going to lead to negative consequences. With that in mind, have a blessed one.